Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits and welcome to the summary of the ChemKnits Chanukah Special. In this video I am going to show all of the yarn that I dyed for this week, including the bonus skeins, and then I'm going to show each of the yarns next to some of their reskeined miniskeins, so that way you can see what the visual difference looks like between the skein as it was dyed and then what it would look like reskeined, because sometimes these differences can be really striking. You can find all of the dyeing videos in the 2018 ChemKnits Chanukah Special, and there are also going to be some other fun bonus videos. Today I need to start figuring out the order in which I want to share these yarns. I know that our sunset colorway right here is going to be number 1. And I know that our Lurex blend that is speckled blue and white and silver is going to be night 8. But I need to determine the order of the rest of these colors. All right, I think that this is the order for the Chanukah Special. Here we have 8 different skeins of hand-dyed yarn that are 8 different yarn bases, and I used 8 different dyeing techniques using a number of different types of dye to create these colorways, to sort of create this sampler of some of my favorite techniques. One of the fun things about this project is that I had never dyed many of these bases before, so I didn't necessarily know exactly how the specific technique would work on that base. And so there was an element of surprise along the way for me as well. All of these yarn bases came from Knit Picks, and if you would like to learn more about any of them, you can find links in the video description. We started with Paragon, which is 50% merino, 25% baby alpaca, 25% silk. Imagination is 50% merino, 25% nylon, and 25% alpaca. Gloss is 30% silk, 70% merino. Andean Treasure is 100% alpaca. Galileo is 50% merino wool, 50% viscose from bamboo. Bare Hair is 80% merino wool, 20% angora. Capra is 85% merino, 15% cashmere. And finally, Alex is 66% baby alpaca, 34% Lurex. And of all of them, this one is not technically a bare yarn base, but it did come in a cream. And so that was the base that we overdyed. The one thing that all of these yarns have in common is that none of them are superwash. I believe that the superwash treatment is a chemical treatment that helps sort of smooth out the fibers a bit, so that way when you wash them, you won't get a felted mess. But one thing that the superwash process does is I've found that superwash yarns absorb color a lot faster than their non-superwash counterparts. And so it was really fun to see how these techniques worked on these yarns. And in particular, I found that silk blends and alpaca blends absorb dye a little slower than even just 100% wool. So going into this, I had a lot of questions and a lot of curiosity, and I think that we found something really fun. As for the 8 techniques, we did some solar dyeing where we mixed the yarn and food coloring into jars and let the sun heat set them. We dip dyed this yarn into some Rit liquid dyes, one end at a time, to create sort of a subtle repeating colorway. With this one, we used a combination of Jacquard acid dyes and Kool-Aid to first kettle dye and then speckle the yarn. Here we used Easter egg dye tablets to create a rainbow using a low immersion technique in a steam pan. On the Galileo, we used dried tulip tie-dye powders and sprinkled it onto the yarn sort of like a hand painting fashion, and then steam set the color to create this very painterly look. On the bare hair, we used RIT liquid dyes to hand paint a colorway that is mostly black with a pop of color at one end. In the capra, first we did some low immersion dyeing with jacquard acid dyes to create a really bright colorway. And then we did a glazing technique by immersing the entire skein into some black dye. And then finally, on our lurex, we did a speckling technique in the steam pan, low immersion, with some dry jacquard acid dye powder. I think it's really fun that if you were to go and try to recreate one of the techniques from one of these videos on a different yarn base, you might get something really different. Like for example, with the third one with the gloss with the speckles, if that was superwash, we would have had sharp, sharp, sharp speckles. And the same thing with the lurex one with the jacquard acid dyes. In that one, I actually had a bonus yarn where I showed just how sharp these speckles can be on a superwash yarn. For the bonus skeins that I needed to dye to either use up some of the dye I had pulled, to help me clear the dye bath, so that way I could do another step, I used some of my favorite bases, Hawthorne, Stroll, and Swish. These, unlike the yarns that I dyed as the official Chanukah sampler, these yarns all have a superwash component, which means I knew that they would absorb that dye really fast, and I think that we got some really beautiful sort of leftover, leave no dye left behind type yarns. I have added these leftover yarns to the ChemKnits Creations Etsy store. So if you loved any of the bonus yarns from these videos, head on over to the shop so that way you can snag one up. Now I need to go start winding some mini skeins so that way I can assemble the 2018 ChemKnits Chanukah sampler packages. It took me a few attempts to create the limited edition 2018 ChemKnits Chanukah colorway. I played around with a few techniques before settling on dyeing a twisted hank of yarn 3 different times in 3 different colors. And so I am pleased, and oh so pleased, with this colorway that I am calling Melted Wax. This is a technique that is not done with dye lots. Really, because even when this was done in 3 batches, and even within one batch, there are a lot of variables depending on how the skeins were twisted and which colors from the previous round had exposure to the next dye, etc., etc. So while each of these are really different, ultimately, they are extremely similar with all the same intensity of colors throughout. If you want to see how I arrived at this colorway, there were 2 videos that came out last night. One where I show the whole dyeing process for this colorway, and then a second that is a time lapse where you can watch me dye all 12 of these ones that are about to be wrapped up, labeled, and packaged in your Chanukah sampler boxes. I wrapped up some of the first packages and I am excited to send them off. I have little foam dreidel stickers on top of a scalloped label. The mini skeins are wrapped in tissue paper inside these organza bags with snowflakes on them. And on the back of the scalloped label, there is another sticker that has all of the fiber content for the yarn that is in that package. Paragon is a sport weight yarn that is 50% fine merino wool, 25% baby alpaca, and 25% mulberry silk. And we dyed this yarn with the Wilton Colorway Color Performance food coloring system, and we used the heat of the sun to set the color, stuffing and layering everything into a mason jar to give us this variegated sunset colorway. I think that what you're going to see as a common theme as we look at a 10-gram mini skein versus either the 100-gram or 50-gram skein, that a lot of these are going to look really similar and they're going to look really stripy, and looking at the mini skein, it's not necessarily easy to tell how long or short the different color repeats are. We dip dyed the Bare Imagination base into 2 different colors of liquid RIT dyes. The Bare Imagination is a fingering weight yarn that is 50% merino, 25% superfine alpaca, 25% nylon. This yarn absorbed the dye relatively slowly, and we got these beautiful muted, medium saturated tones. And when you dip dye the yarn like this and have the yarn half one color and half another, depending on how you knit it, you could either end up with some micro stripes or maybe even some pooling or some spiraling. This colorway is possibly the most repeating of all of the yarns that I dyed for this Chanukah sampler. And again, I think that in the mini skein, it is really hard to tell how short or long these color sections are. And when I show some of the other ones that look very stripy like this in the mini skein, a lot of those have a lot shorter color repeats. And yet those mini skeins look alike like this one. And yet they're probably going to swatch differently. If you do just like a short little swatch, you will see micro stripes with this one where you might not with others. And again, it can be hard to tell what the color progressions are. Do the colors slowly fade into one another, or do you have sharp contrasts between like the different tones here? And I suppose this is a reason why if you are a reskeiner, you should always show a picture of what the yarn looks like before it was reskeined, because I think that contains an important piece of information for the audience. On this gloss fingering base, which is 70% merino, 30% silk, we first kettle dyed the yarn to get a semi-solid base in some jacquard acid dyes. And then we attempted to speckle the silk blend with Kool-Aid. Now I know that silk blends absorb color slower than say wool, and especially superwash wools. But I was curious to see if we would see defined specks on this yarn like we see on superwash wool, or even non-superwash wool. You can get some sort of larger speckles. Or if it would sort of spread out more and we'd get some splotchier tones. I think that speckled yarns like this one tend to have a more consistent feel as you knit them up versus a highly variegating yarn that has a either semi-repeating or repeating colorway. And so in this case, I think that you can still feel that this is a tonal, sort of splotchy colored yarn when it's reskeined or in the original dyed form. And I don't know if it necessarily looks better here, but I think that this is a case where looking at it, you can still tell that the reds are short repeats overall. Whereas with some of the other yarns where you have even just a section that's a couple inches, it can be really hard to tell if the section is 3 inches long or 8 inches long. And that can make a huge difference in the way a colorway looks. But this is a case where personally I don't think reskeining hurts at all, and if anything it might even help to sort of visualize what the yarn feels like overall. Andean Treasure is a sport weight 100% baby alpaca yarn. It is so soft, and I am so excited that we see this beautiful spectrum of colors. We dyed this yarn using a low immersion technique in a steam pan with 9 different colors of Easter egg dye tablets. In general, alpaca needs a little more acid than wool to absorb color, and therefore I'm just really excited that this worked and that the colors didn't all completely blend together. Looking at yarn wound in a mini skein can sort of tone down the brightness, because versus seeing all of these rainbow tones laid out in our 100 gram skein, you're looking at sort of the combination and mixture of them, and almost your eye sort of sees the average of it versus recognizing each individual color on its own. And I would say again that it is pretty hard for your eye to determine how long each color repeat is. And I think that when you look at these yarns reskeined, it's hard to also tell what the color progression is. Are these in a random order, or are they in like a rainbow spectrum order? And so I feel like I'm sort of being a little negative on reskeined yarns, but ultimately I think that we have all these colorways that are fairly different from one another, and the miniskeins have a more like similar feel. Galileo is a sport weight yarn that is 50% merino wool, 50% viscose from bamboo. And we dyed this yarn using dry tulip tie-dye powder to sort of speckle it. Now normally, if I'm dyeing this yarn with, say, food coloring or acid dyes, only the merino will take up the color. This yarn still absorbs a lot of color and is really lovely, but I was really excited to use the tulip dyes on it because this yarn, the tulip dyes should dye the entirety of the yarn, the bamboo and the merino. And so I think that the result is beautiful and almost indistinguishable between a superwash merino nylon version that we did of this colorway. I really like seeing the reskeined yarn on a more speckled watercolor type yarn, where the patches of color are really small overall. I think that in this case, the yarn gives a really nice feel to how the yarn might look like, or how a knit project might look, which I suppose all the others do as well. But I think that sort of breaking up some of the larger sections of color really helps from this. And in some of the videos I mentioned thinking about how balanced the yarn was that we dyed, and all the mini skeins feel very, very similar. I didn't notice any obvious like gradients or anything like that as I was winding them. Bear Capra is 85% merino wool, 15% cashmere, and it is a DK weight yarn. To create this yarn, first we did some random low immersion dyeing with bright primary colors of jacquard acid dye. Then we dipped them into a vat of black acid dye, going for a sort of glazed look. Since I think this yarn absorbs dye a little slower than, say, a superwash wool, you don't really feel like you have that small layer of color on top of the yarn, but we do see the original tones showing through in this very like dark, earthy colorway. My specific inspiration for this one was the moment that the last Chanukah candle burnt out and you see the room sort of go into this darkness, but with the haze of smoke. And I mean, for me, I think it works. I know people probably gasped when I dropped this beautiful yarn into the black, but I still think that it was beautiful before and it's beautiful right now. The color sections are overall fairly short in this yarn, and so I don't think that reskeining does it a disservice at all in the way that it mixes them together. I think that you can still tell that there are random small patches of color. Maybe you can't tell whether or not they are repeating, but I mean, I think that these two skeins still have a very similar feel to them. We hand painted the 50-gram bear hair skeins, which are fingering weight, 80% merino wool, 20% angora. And we hand painted this with liquid RIT dyes to create a colorway that sort of was reminiscent of seeing the candles burning in a corner in an otherwise dark room. Here is another colorway where once it's reskeined, it doesn't give you as much of a sense of how the yarn was dyed or how these color sections will repeat. You can tell there's a lot more black than the colors, but it's unclear, what percentage of the yarn this colored portion takes up. For the 8th night of our sampler, the yarn was the stunning Glittery Alux, which is a fingering weight yarn, 66% baby alpaca, 34% lurex. And the lurex, while it doesn't take up any dye, gives the yarn a glorious shimmer, and we almost, in some of the darker color patches, see reverse speckles, because I think a strand of the Lurex is sort of wound around each of the multiple plies in this yarn. We dyed this yarn in a steam pan and speckling with dry jacquard acid dyes. Reskeining makes the least amount of a difference on a speckled yarn like this one. Since the colors are already sort of spread out randomly all over the yarn, I think that the reskeined yarn could give a slightly better feel of how it's going to look. That you're going to have this non-repeating, non-pooling colorway. As I said with the others, it is fairly averaged out, but you don't look at this and think, oh goodness, are there going to be big patches of white or anything like that. So it does help the yarn feel overall very balanced to see it reskeined. I considered reskeining one of these since I was able to, for the official 8 Nights of Chanukah videos, show the mini skein next to what the full skein looked like, to chat a little bit about that. But in the end, given that my preference is to see yarn as it was dyed, I decided to leave these as they are. Most of the other yarns, as I was making the mini skeins, felt pretty balanced. Like, I didn't see any real difference from mini skein to mini skein. And so, given that each one of these is unique within this color story, I think if I were to reskein one, observations about that one skein might not necessarily carry through to the rest. So I am going to leave them in their natural form. Sometimes reskeining yarn is 100% necessary. Whether you're making mini skeins for a sampler, the yarn is really tangled and so you need to reskein it, or the original skein, if it was self-striping, could be so big that you need to reduce the size in order to give it to someone else. I think that one of the really fun exercises of this sampler was getting to see so many different examples of yarn as it was dyed and then reskeined, and then to see just how similar and different the reskeined yarns look to one another. The reskeined yarns in the Paragon, Imagination, and Andean Treasure look very similar, but the color changes are either fairly random, semi-repeating, or repeating and a lot longer. So from those 3 reskeined mini skeins, it can be really hard to tell what the yarn is going to look like, and if you'd get something with micro stripes or pooling, or if the repeats are smaller. And so this is one reason why, again, I advocate showing a picture of, if you are a reskeiner, show a picture of the yarn before it was reskeined, so that way people can see what it looked like. One positive thing about reskeining is it sort of averages the yarn together a bit. And so it can help you it makes it easier to visualize what something you make out of the yarn might look like, whether you're weaving, crocheting, or knitting. And yeah, and so while it can be hard to then tell the color progression, if it is something more repeating, you get a sense of, if I look at this from far away and sort of squint, what is it gonna look like? And so that is one reason why I like looking at reskeined yarns. So what did you think? 8 Nights of Chanukah, 8 different techniques, 8 yarn bases, 8 unique colorways. I had so much fun creating this series, and if you enjoyed it as much as I did, this is something that I would love to try to do again sometime. And I know we keep saying 8, 8, 8, but don't forget about the 9th bonus colorway that I've added along the bottom. And there are all the other bonus yarns that we dyed along the way that I didn't even include in this final image of the 2018 ChemKnits Chanukah Special recap. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I really hope that you enjoyed this special week as much as I enjoyed making it. If you liked this series, please subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. I normally release 2 new yarn dyeing videos every week, but many of the themes that were present during this special are also present through my general dyeing attitude. I love to try new techniques for the very first time on camera, and I love experimenting with a bunch of different dyes and yarn bases. Some of you have now opened up samplers and are seeing something very similar to all of these mini skeins in your own home. I would love to hear what you think about the different yarns. Which one is your favorite? Which technique do you think will be the coolest to work up? And share the pictures. Please share them with me. There is a Facebook group for ChemKnits fans called ChemKnits Lab, and people share their own dyeing adventures and knitting adventures, and we have a lot of fun there. If you are interested in playing with any of these yarn bases or learning more about any of them, I have links in the video description to all of the yarn bases and dyes and other materials that I used in this series to create these skeins of yarn. You will also find links to the ChemKnits Patreon, which is a great way to support the channel if you are a ChemKnits superfan, and the ChemKnits Creations Etsy store, where you can buy yarn that I have dyed in past or upcoming YouTube videos. Finally, I would like to wish all of you a very happy Chanukah, happy New Year, happy holidays, happy family time, winter snow, or if you're on the other side of the world, happy summer. I hope that you all have a wonderful holiday season, no matter what you celebrate. And thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me and celebrating Chanukah with me and my family.